Tonight's guest speaker, Tonya Wiley, is the founder and president of Havenworth Coastal Conservation, an organization dedicated to promoting the protection of imperiled marine species through research, outreach, and education. Tonya has more than 30 years of experience in the field of marine conservation with a particular emphasis on sharks and rays. Tonight, she's going to tell us all about the amazing prehistoric looking sawfish. It is with great pleasure that I welcome Tonya Wiley.
Thank you, Zach, for the introduction. And thank you, Florida Oceanographic Society, for hosting all of us this evening and bringing us together for this great lecture series. And thank all of you for joining us tonight to learn about the endangered sawfish of Florida. So the sawfish is a very large, distinctive type of ray. So they have a shark-like body, but sharks have their gill slits on the side of their body, and rays, like sawfish, have their gill slits on the underside of their body. So that makes sawfish a type of ray. Kind of easy to see how they get their name, right? They have this hedge trimmer extension off the front of their face. We call that a rostrum, commonly called a saw, how they get their name. There's 5 species of sawfish found around the world. And in the United States, historically, we had 2 species of sawfish that at one time were both considered very common and abundant in our US waters. So that's what a sawfish is. We're going to talk briefly about what a sawfish is not. So all of these fish on the left here are bony fish, have a skeleton made of bone, and they have one gill opening on the side. So the swordfish, paddlefish, needlefish, gar, a lot of times this is what people envision when they hear the word sawfish, but these are all bony fish with the one gill opening. Saw shark is a type of shark, very similar to the sawfish, but has its gill openings here on the side, making it a shark. And they are not sawtooth sharks. We hear that word a lot. I'm not really sure the origin in that, but the sawtooth is actually a mountain range out in Idaho. It's not an animal that swims in our coastal waters. So historically, as I mentioned, here in the US, we had 2 species of sawfish. On the left is the small-tooth sawfish, Pristis pectinata, and on the right is the large-tooth sawfish, Pristis pristis. And the easiest way to tell the 2 apart is by the number of teeth on the rostrum or saw and the shape of the rostrum. So the small-tooth sawfish here on the left has 22 to 29 teeth on either side of the saw. And these aren't real teeth, actual teeth like they have in their mouth. These are actually modified scales. And they'll grow continuously throughout the life of the animal, just like our fingernails. So they use their saw to find food, to hunt for fish. So they'll break those occasionally, split them occasionally, just like we do our fingernails. But they grow constantly, and they'll grow back as long as they don't lose the pulp cavity where the tooth is formed. Those teeth will just continuously grow throughout the life of the animal. The number of teeth that an individual sawfish has is actually set during development, and they can vary by as much as 3. So one individual might have 24 on one side and 27 on the other, or 23 on one side and 26 on the other. And that's one way that we can identify individual sawfish when we see multiple ones of them together. The large-tooth sawfish, on the other hand, that one has 16 to 20 teeth on either side of the rostrum. And you can see here that the saw where it's attached to the body is much wider at the base here than it is at the tip. The small-tooth sawfish is almost the same width all the way down. There's some other differences with fin placement. So you can see here the dorsal fin on the large-tooth sawfish is much more forward on the body, much closer to the head than it is here on the small-tooth sawfish, which is much further back. The pectoral fins, the side fins, are very round on the small-tooth sawfish and pointed here on the large-tooth. And the large tooth sawfish has a lower lobe on its caudal fin or the tail fin, and that's missing, absent on the small tooth sawfish. So some morphological characteristics here to tell them apart. But again, the easiest way to tell them apart is by the tooth count here on the rostrum. So these are where these two species used to be found historically in the United States. So on these maps in red is where these species used to be found. Again, the small tooth sawfish is on the left and the large tooth sawfish on the right. The small tooth sawfish, we had that one in the US from Texas, all throughout the Gulf of Mexico, over here to Florida, and up the Atlantic coast as far as North Carolina. We even had one animal that was landed in New York. We're not sure where it was caught, but it was brought to port in New York. The small tooth sawfish was always more common east of the Mississippi River, so in the eastern Gulf of Mexico and Atlantic. Compared to the large tooth sawfish over here, which was only found in the Gulf of Mexico from Texas around to Florida, but this species was always much more common west of the Mississippi, predominantly in Texas and Mexico. So I wanted to walk you guys through a little bit of the history of sawfish, focusing on Florida here, and show you some of these amazing postcards and old photos and newspaper clippings that we were able to find from sawfish throughout the state. It just kind of gives you an idea of how common they used to be, how big they get, and how people were interacting with them through history. So we're going to start up in the Panhandle here, Panama City, Cedar Key, kind of in the Big Bend. I'm in Tampa Bay, so this is where I am in St. Petersburg. If any of you have been to St. Petersburg lately, we just opened a new pier, but several iterations of the pier ago, it used to be a railroad trestle. And here's a photograph of a large sawfish stretched across that railroad trestle at what's now the St. Pete Pier. Another sawfish here in St. Petersburg was 14 feet 6 inches, weighed 660 pounds. And just to give you some scale, so here is a man, and here's the tail of the sawfish. It goes all the way up here, and here's the tip of the rostrum, tip of the saw, all the way up here. So enormous 14-foot animal there. Some more here in the St. Pete area, from Tampa Bay area, from the early 1900s. Right by where I live and work in Manatee River at the south end of Tampa Bay. Here's some old pictures again of the sawfish that was brought into what was then our tomato port. So we're going to go a little south past Sarasota Bay here. Now we're into Venice. Another old photograph here from the 20s, Peace River, which is in Charlotte Harbor. Big animal there. Naples Pier. So Naples Pier, historically, we've gotten a lot of reports from that area, and we still today get a lot of reports of sawfish being caught, large sawfish being caught and seen there. You can find several videos online of people catching big sawfish off the Naples Pier. And on this photograph, there's 4 sawfish in this picture. Again, for scale, here is a man, and here the sawfish goes all the way up to here. And there's 4 sawfish, as I mentioned, in this picture. And here's a tarpon that you imagine, is a good sized tarpon because they kept it and they're displaying it and they're proud of it. But it kind of looks like a finger mullet compared to these enormous sawfish that they also caught and hung up here. A couple spotted eagle rays down here on the ground as well. So headed over to your coast now. So this is St. Lucie River in Stewart area in the early 1900s. Here's a sawfish in Daytona that was caught, was already missing its saw by the time the picture was taken. I don't know if it was caught without the saw or if they removed it before they took the picture. Those of you who are familiar with Fort Pierce, here's a picture of a couple sawfish at the PP Cobb dock, which later became the PP Cobb General Store, which unfortunately just closed down last year because of the pandemic. A couple from Indian River Lagoon here. So here's a picture out of an old book. The book was published in 1888 and shows a picture of these guys in this tiny little boat harpooning or spearfishing for sawfish in the Indian River. And here's a big sawfish hanging in a tree from Crane Creek in the 1920s. Some more here, Indian River Lagoon in the 1930s, driving through town, this flatbed truck here. And any of you familiar with the area, here's Sewell's Point, 1916, 3 big sawfish that they caught here with the, you can see this old pier behind them here. West Palm Beach, another one. And here's an old book again, a 1920s book that shows 2 big sawfish being brought in into Miami on this boat. And you know, now when you go down to the Keys as a tourist, you can stop in Shell World and you can buy a sand dollar or sea urchin or all kinds of things as your souvenir. Well, back in the day, tourists used to buy sawfish rostrum as their souvenirs for their trip to the Keys. And here's a young kid who was selling sawfish rostra to tourists in Key West, right near what's now the Key West Aquarium. So those of you who've ever been to the Keys, I'm sure you've driven past and may have stopped into Theater of the Sea. Great little aquarium there. And in the 1950s, for several years, they had a sawfish in their facility there. It was missing part of its rostrum, about half of its rostrum, but it was named Rip. And they had him on display there for several years in the mid-1900s. Key West Aquarium, if any of you were there several decades ago, but they used to have a sawfish named Buzz that tourists could pay to feed. So they would put a fish on a little rod and you were able to feed the sawfish there in this little open water exhibit there at the Key West Aquarium. Quite interesting. I remember doing that as a kid. So I put these other two postcards in here because from a scientific and biological standpoint, we learned a lot when we found these 2 photographs. It was kind of hard to imagine, but you know, there wasn't any research done on sawfish prior to about 2000, which is crazy. So when we started the work, we had to dig through all of these newspapers and postcards and talk to fishermen and look in their logbooks because we didn't have the scientific literature to refer to learn about what was known about the species. So we found this postcard, and you can see that here's the mother sawfish, but there's 2 fully formed little baby sawfish here that presumably she dropped after being caught. And from Melbourne, again, over by you guys, here's a photograph of a sawfish. The sawfish is so big that the saw isn't even in the photograph here, but there's 11 baby sawfish hanging, you know, in the tree and off the ropes on this picture. So this photograph gave us an idea, you know, that the sawfish are born fully formed, live young, and that they have, you know, about 10, 12 young, because we were able to see 11 in this picture. So this old historic picture from over 100 years ago gave us so much information. And the picture on the left here kind of exemplifies the history of sawfish, you know, in the U.S., particularly here in Florida. So in the 1940s in the Florida Keys, these guys dressed up in their fancy 3-piece wool suits. Here, you know, we're very spoiled to wearing our Columbia wicking fishing gear. I can't imagine dressing like this to go fishing, but they went out on this side of the boat. We're able to count 30 sawfish. So that's how common they were, that these guys could go out and in one day catch at least 30 sawfish. We don't know how many are on the other side of the boat, how many are, you know, in the boat, but hanging on this side of the boat, here's the largest one here. And here's several babies. So in one day's fishing, they were able to go out and catch 30 sawfish, at least 30 sawfish. But they also kept that many sawfish. So in one day, this many sawfish were removed from the population down in the Florida Keys. On the right is our Florida state record sawfish. It's 648 pounds, 15 feet, 4 inches. So those of you who are fishermen know that records are done by weight. So this sawfish was actually put on a boat trailer and driven over to Fort Lauderdale to be weighed. In 1961, it was caught in Flamingo in Everglades National Park. and that will probably now forever be our Florida state record sawfish. So the large tooth sawfish, that's the other species. That's the one that was always more common west of the Mississippi River, predominantly in Texas and Mexico. Here's an old newspaper article of a gentleman who caught two big large tooth sawfish in Galveston, Texas, which is where I went to school at Texas A&M. Caught them on the Galveston jetties, if any of you guys are familiar with that area, but two enormous large tooth sawfish here. So this species was, very common in the early 1900s. I could show you similar pictures like we just walked through Florida. We have similar pictures like that in Texas, newspaper articles, photographs up and down the coast of Texas. So we know in the early 1900s that the large tooth sawfish was very common. But already by the 1950s, that population was already becoming severely depleted. We weren't seeing them show up in newspapers and magazines anymore, or in logbooks of fishermen. And the last confirmed report of the large tooth sawfish in Florida was in 1943. So that's been 80 years since we've had it here in Florida. And in all of the United States, the last record of this species was in Texas in 1961. So it's been 60 years now since we've had this species documented in US waters. And so we can consider this species to be locally extinct. There are some still down in Central and South America, but yeah, unfortunately, it's been 60 years since we've had this one in the US. The small tooth sawfish, that one's doing a little better. That's the one that we're here to talk about tonight. So I mentioned when we started this project that there wasn't scientific literature on them. So we had to dig through all those logbooks and magazines and newspapers. And so we made these maps. And each one of these yellow dots is where we know someone caught or saw a sawfish. And these records go all the way back to 1782. And so you can see here that we have records of small tooth sawfish from Brownsville, Texas, through the Gulf of Mexico, over here to Florida, up the mid-Atlantic. And here's that one I mentioned that was landed in New York on Long Island. So the range historically was from Texas, up the mid-Atlantic. But what I want to point out is this red circle here. So in this red area is where over half of those records are. So we had 3,400 records going back to 1782, and over half of those records were in the 10,000 Islands, basically from Charlotte Harbor through the 10,000 Islands, Everglades National Park, Florida Keys, that area. That's where half of those records were. And in this darker blue is where 90% of those records were. And that's basically from Tampa Bay up around here, up through the Indian River Lagoon area. So 90% of all of those records we had were from, lower peninsular Florida. So now we're going to fast forward. We're only going to look at records from 1964 on. So I mentioned for the large tooth sawfish, we'd already lost that species completely from US waters by 1964. And you can see a similar story here happening for the small tooth sawfish. So we've completely lost all of the records north of Florida here in the Atlantic, a few hanging on over here in the central Texas coast. This blue area has shrunk, as you can see. So now it's the south end of Tampa Bay. We've lost much of the Indian River Lagoon by now already. And even this red area has shrunk, where now it's only the 10,000 Islands and Everglades National Park area. And then when we fast forward, now we're only looking at records from 1990 on. All records are gone from the Gulf of Mexico, outside of Florida. All records are gone from the Atlantic, north of Florida. Now the population is constrained pretty much just to peninsular Florida, and all of these ranges have shrunk again. So still focused around the Southwest Florida area here, 10,000 Islands and Everglades National Park. So a very sad shrinking in the range. We've lost 95% of their distribution, where they used to be found from Texas to Florida and up the mid-Atlantic. Now they're confined to peninsular Florida. So a 95% retraction in their range. So people always ask, how is that possible? How did we have two species of sawfish and we've completely lost one already? And the other one is now an endangered species. And really, there's three main reasons why. Obviously, you can imagine one of them is fishing mortality. All those photographs that I showed you of people catching and keeping sawfish, they were a great sport fish. People like to catch them rod and reel, but also harpooning and spearing. But then in the mid 1900s is when we started really mass fishing with nets, whether that be shrimp trawls, gill nets, cast nets. And sawfish are very easily, as you can imagine, because of that toothed rostra, they're very easily caught in nets, which is great for us who are doing research, makes it easy for us to catch them. But, a commercial fisherman, their net is their livelihood. That's how they earn their living. So, they weren't going to cut their net to get the sawfish out of the net. So they would usually either hang up the sawfish in the net and wait for it to die, or they would kill the sawfish, cut the saw off, get rid of the animal and then untangle it from the net. So a lot of mortality from both recreational fishing, as you can see here, and commercial fishing, as you can see here. And like so many things, loss of inshore nursery habitat. I'm going to talk about this a little more later, but inshore coastal areas are nursery habitat for young sawfish, and obviously, we've developed a lot of the shoreline in Florida and in the United States. We've ripped out mangroves and we've built seawalls and marinas and condominiums and beaches. So they've lost a lot of that nursery habitat that the young need to survive, to grow, to be adults. And a low reproductive capacity. So that's a fancy scientific way of saying they don't produce very many young, very many offspring. So I showed you that one picture of the boat with 30 sawfish on the one side, and then the one picture of the sawfish hanging in the tree that had 11 babies on it. And so we were taking sawfish out of the population much, much quicker than they were able to replenish and put back into the population, unfortunately. And there are a lot of uses for sawfish and sawfish parks. So I mentioned the aquarium. So Key West Aquarium had a sawfish back in the day. There's two at SeaWorld in Orlando. That's the closest for any of us to go see. Those actually came through Key West in the 1980s. There's about a dozen aquariums in the United States where you can see live sawfish. And you don't even have to go to an aquarium to see them. The Dallas World Aquarium has a camera in their exhibit where the sawfish are. So you can actually log on and watch them feed the sawfish, watch the sawfish swimming around. It's quite soothing to watch. If you go to the Dallas World Aquarium website, you can watch the sawfish in their exhibit. Shark fin soup is another big problem for sharks, obviously you've probably heard of, but also for sawfish. Sawfish fins are very highly prized in the shark fin soup market because they're considered to be white fins. They're very light fins. And so here's a tail fin, a caudal fin from one sawfish that was actually confiscated in trade that was headed to the shark fin soup market in Asia. Curios and trophies. So, a lot of the people that caught sawfish would keep the saw as a trophy to hang up on their wall. And then I showed you the picture of that little kid who was selling sawfish rostra to tourists down in the Keys. In Asia, they do sell sawfish rostra in pharmacies where they grind them up and use them as the base to make medicines. They're also used for ceremonial weapons. So here's a really good example of that in these two photographs here. So they'll take a sawfish rostra, fit the handle to it. They'll decorate them very ornately. Sometimes they'll inlay them in gold with the family crest, tell a story, they'll paint a scene on them. Some of them are really quite elaborate for these ceremonies. One of the more unusual uses is the rostral teeth are used to make artificial spurs in the cockfighting industry. So down in Central and South America, they'll take the teeth off the rostrum and they'll split them in half long ways, and they'll affix this little metal clamp to it that they'll use to attach to the foot of the rooster for artificial spurs. There have been some NGOs who have tried to create artificial versions of this. to alleviate this as a pressure on sawfish, but the industry really likes the sawfish material, and so they continue to use the sawfish rostral teeth as cockfighting spurs. Historically, the skin from sawfish was used to make leather. In some places, their meat was used for food, also used for bait, and the liver oil was used for lamps historically. So the decline in sawfish really kind of happened unnoticed. I mentioned that there wasn't anybody studying them, so scientifically, nobody was monitoring the population. Really, the only people who were noticing the decline in the population were the fishermen, who weren't seeing them as much anymore. And the state of Florida was actually proactive and the first to do anything for sawfish in the United States. And in 1992, protected both species of sawfish from harvest in Florida and made both of them catch and release species only. In 1995, I have this little asterisk here. So Florida instituted an inshore gill net ban in 1995. That didn't have anything to do with sawfish at the time, but is likely one of the reasons why we do still have sawfish here in Florida waters is because of that inshore gill net ban, which was such a source of mortality for sawfish here in Florida waters. So I added that to the list, and I'll touch on that a little bit again later. So in 1999, NOAA Fisheries received a petition from the Ocean Conservancy to list both species of sawfish as endangered species on the Endangered Species Act. And that's when I came in, moved from Texas over here to Florida. That's when we started the status review in 2000. That's when we were digging up all those newspapers and magazines and talking to fishermen. This was back really before the internet. So I remember spending a lot of time in libraries, actually looking at microfish, digging up all those old records, going to libraries, museums, and finding that wealth of information and all of those old photographs. And we concluded, as you can see, from those range maps that I showed you, that drastic decline, that they did warrant being protected. And so in 2003, the small-tooth sawfish, Pristis pectinata, was listed as endangered on the Endangered Species Act. We then spent the next several years developing a recovery plan for sawfish. It's available online if you want to read it. But it lays out all of the steps that we need to take to save the sawfish that are still left in our waters, but ultimately recover them. So our goal is that sawfish re-inhabit areas where they used to be, that we see them in Georgia again, we see them in Alabama, Texas again. We definitely need to see them out of South Florida. We need to see their range expand. And so the plan lays out step by step things that we need to do to make sure that that happens and how we go about it. In 2013, all 5 species of sawfish received protection on CITES, which stands for the Convention of International Trade of Endangered Species. So you think about that like sea turtle shells or rhino tusks, white shark jaws. Once something is protected on CITES, it should limit or restrict or ban the trade of those parts from one country to another. And in 2014, we listed the large-tooth sawfish as an endangered species here in the US. So even though we haven't had one for 6 decades, in case there's one swimming around out there, or in case one comes up into the Gulf of Mexico from south, it's going to be protected. So both species of sawfish are protected both by Florida state regulations and by federal Endangered Species Act regulations. So in 2009, we also designated critical habitat for juvenile small-tooth sawfish. And that didn't create a closed area or a protected area or somewhere that you're not allowed into. It didn't rope off part of Everglades National Park. But what it did was ensure that any projects, any construction projects, any research projects like ours, anything that's either funded or permitted by the federal government has to be reviewed to make sure that it's not killing sawfish and that it's not adversely modifying that critical habitat. And so we had to identify very specific physical and biological features that are important for sawfish, for juvenile sawfish, that may need special considerations. So, for example, here's a baby sawfish in Chokoloskee at the north end of Everglades National Park. Very shallow water swimming by this red mangrove shoreline here. So, you know, if somebody wanted to come in and remove these mangroves and put in a seawall, that project would have to be reviewed to make sure it wasn't adversely modifying sawfish habitat. And so we designated 2 areas as critical for juvenile sawfish because they are nursery areas. The northern area is in Charlotte Harbor. So this is the Peace and Myakka Rivers, Caloosahatchee River, and around Sanibel Island. And then the southern unit is 10,000 Islands and Everglades National Park and Florida Bay. Because these areas are nursery habitat for young sawfish, because they provide them ample food, but also provide them refuge from predators. And here's a picture of a bull shark that was caught in Florida Bay. And you can see here is a baby sawfish that this bull shark had swallowed. And so the features that we designated as critical habitat for juvenile sawfish are euryhaline waters. And those are waters that are most often found in bays, river mouths. Euryhaline means that it's where freshwater flow meets, you know, Gulf or saltwater tidal influence. So it's where freshwater flow meets the tidal influence from the ocean or the Gulf of Mexico, where the salinity is not full strength seawater and it's not freshwater either. It's in the middle range where the salinity fluctuates. And waters less than 1 meter or 3 feet deep. So here's my colleague Bo in Florida Bay with a sawfish. This one's probably about a year old, and a great picture of the critical habitat here. So shallow, sandy, muddy bottom, but with red mangrove shoreline. And here's a great video that our colleague Michael Scholl with Save Our Seas Foundation took in the 10,000 Islands with his drone. And I'm going to play it for a little bit and be quiet so that you guys can just enjoy seeing these little baby sawfish. Here it is right here. Perfect critical habitat, shallow water, euryhaline, mangrove shoreline, soft bottom. So I'm going to play this for you so you can enjoy these little baby sawfish swimming around. So cute, so tranquil. So I'm going to point out here, there's now 2 sawfish in this video. And the reason that mangrove shoreline is critical habitat for these young sawfish, right now it's low tide, so the water's not up in the mangroves. But as the water rises, these sawfish are going to follow that very shallow water up into the mangrove proper. So at a high tide, when the water is in these mangroves, these sawfish will actually be up laying amongst the red mangrove crop roots. And that's to avoid the sharks that are swimming by in the deeper water down here, as you saw in that one picture of the sawfish in the mouth of the bull shark. So just great video that he got there in the 10,000 Islands. So there's several of us that have directed field research projects on sawfish throughout Florida. This is me. I'm up here in the Tampa Bay area. The state, Florida Fish and Wildlife, is focusing on the Charlotte Harbor area. Probably one of the populations of sawfish that is the most studied. They live and work right here and have had tremendous success researching the sawfish population in the Charlotte Harbor area. NOAA Fisheries is working on the juveniles in 10,000 Islands in Everglades National Park, where that drone footage was taken. And Florida State University is focusing on the adult sawfish in Florida Bay and the Keys, and now starting to come up the Atlantic coast of Florida, now that we're starting to get more reports from up that way. So we're very lucky to have the guys over at Harbor Branch that are doing research on sharks and rays grouper over your way, and they've actually been able to respond to several sawfish that have been caught on the coast over there and tag them for us. You may have seen in the news just a few months ago, the end of last year, that they were able to tag a juvenile sawfish in the St. Lucie River. There's a great article by Ed Killer in the TC Palm edition that you can read about their the success of their trip, and there's also an article by FAU that you can read as well. So they've been able to respond to several reports for us on that coast, and they've been able to tag juvenile sawfish. Look at this right up here in the mangroves. So young sawfish, kind of medium-sized sawfish, and adult sawfish. So now we have several sawfish on that coast that are tagged that we should start getting some very good information on their habitat use, their movements on that side of the coast as well, which is phenomenal. So when we catch a sawfish in the field, of course, we're very excited that we managed to catch an endangered species. It's hard for us sometimes even to find them. But we take a lot of measurements, of course. We measure the length of the saw, or the rostral length, compared to several overall lengths of the body. And what we have found for small-tooth sawfish here in the US is that the rostrum, the saw, is about 20 to 25% of the overall length of the body. It's usually right around 23%. So if we have an isolated rostra that we see in a museum or a tackle shop or somebody's house, or at a bait shop, we can estimate the overall size of the animal from the length of the saw. We determine what sex it is. So a really nice thing about sharks and rays is that you can tell externally if they're male or female. You can't do that with a redfish or a trout, but sharks and rays, the males, have their two external organs for mating. They're called claspers. So here's some on a juvenile sawfish, and here's some on a mature sawfish. So that it's very easy for us to tell if they're male or female. Of course, we put a lot of tags on them and in them to identify individual sawfish and track them. We do this pit tag, which is this little one here. It's about the size of a grain of rice. That's the same technology that you use to microchip your pets. So we insert that right at the base of the dorsal fin. You need a scanning wand to read it, but that has a unique serial number, and that will stay in the animal throughout its entire life. We, of course, put external identifier tags with a phone number and a serial number on there for you to call if you catch a sawfish. We've tried satellite tagging. We've had some success with satellite tags, but not great success. You may be familiar with like OSearch does, live tracking of their white sharks, or even you can go online and Turtle Tracker and follow turtles that have been satellite tagged. The key to a successful satellite tag, though, is that the tag has to break the surface of the water so that it can communicate with the satellite. And because sawfish are a ray and spend most of their life sitting on the bottom or swimming near the bottom, those tags weren't breaking the surface and communicating with the satellites very well. And if they were popping through the surface because they were in shallow water, they were a lot of times under a mangrove overhang where it still couldn't communicate to the satellite. And these guys run about $3,000 each. So we've kind of steered away and aren't using that technology anymore. And we've gone to using internal transmitters. And so we insert these are about the size of a AA, AAA battery. And we'll actually surgically implant that in the body cavity of the sawfish. Those tags can last up to 10 years and provide us long-term tracking data. So these need acoustic receivers, which are about the size of a bank tube or a water bottle. And researchers all throughout the Gulf, all through the Atlantic, really around the world, are installing these acoustic receivers in the water to detect these animals. And the best way to explain this technology is to kind of think about it like your sun pass. If you have a sun pass in your windshield, that's your transmitter. That's similar to the transmitter that we put in a sawfish. So then you just drive through the toll plaza, and the toll plaza is the receiver that detects your transmitter and records the date, the time, and the serial number of your sun pass. So that's the same technology kind of that's used for tracking these animals, and people are tracking tarpon and snook and sharks and sawfish and all kinds of animals with this technology. And there's two groups that are key to the success of using transmitters and receivers, and that's ITAG in the Gulf of Mexico and FACT, the FACT array on the Atlantic coast. And those are cooperative networks of researchers who share the data that they get from their receivers. Because of course, if I tag a sawfish in Tampa Bay and it's heard in the Keys, those aren't going to be my receivers down in the Keys. Or likewise, I may detect somebody's redfish on my receivers that I've put into Tampa Bay. So scientists upload their data to the ITAG and FACT networks as a way to share the data and pool all of our resources to help collaborate with each other, which is just phenomenal. So we're really excited about the transmitters that Mike and Matt with Harbor Branch were able to get in the sawfish over on the Atlantic coast in the Indian River Lagoon, St. Lucie area, so that we can start getting some long-term tracking and movement data from those sawfish. So we also count the teeth on the left side and the right side of the rostra. So as I mentioned, small tooth in the US have 22 to 29 on either side of the rostra, and it can vary by as much as 3. We also take a lot of samples from sawfish. We'll take a small blood sample. We'll cut a very small piece of a fin off about the size of your pinky fingernail to get DNA from us, from information from that. We collect parasites, collect feces, and any samples that we can get from these animals. So the blood we send to the University of North Florida. And our colleague, Jim Gelschleider there in Jacksonville, is trying to help us hone in on mating for sawfish when they mate, looking at the hormone levels in the blood. So we can overlay that with our tracking data and kind of define when and where sawfish are mating. We're still not real sure about that. The fin clip we send to our colleague, Kevin Feldheim in Chicago at the Field Museum. So he's kind of building an ancestry.com, a family tree of sawfish for us, trying to get at how many individuals are in the population reproducing. Are there different populations within Florida? So the DNA that we're able to get from the fin clip is helping answer a lot of those questions. So we have a lot of partners around the country, or really around the world, that are helping us on the Sawfish Project through tagging, analyzing samples, various projects that are going on. We have our Sawfish Recovery Implementation Team. This is led by Adam Brame, who is our Sawfish Recovery Coordinator with NOAA Fisheries. So this team was put together to take that recovery plan that we published in 2009 and implement it. So we are charged with ensuring that everything that we laid out in that recovery plan is coming to fruition, that we have outreach and education programs in place, that we're protecting habitats, that we're reducing mortality in fisheries, things like that. So big shout out to those of us who are working hard. We used to get together every year in person. Here's a billboard that we had down in Key Largo for a couple years ago, and this was actually our last in-person meeting before COVID hit. So now we've been having to meet online like everybody else. But there's a lot of us that are doing policy outreach, conservation efforts, pushing for protections for sawfish in other countries, pushing for trade restrictions on sawfish and sawfish parks. A lot of outreach that we're doing as well. And I specifically want to call out the Sawfish Conservation Society. They have a Facebook page. If any of you want to go, there's an open public Facebook group for Sawfish Conservation Society, and you can go on there. People share photographs of sawfish that they see, videos that they take when they're diving, gorgeous videos. Researchers post updates, and this is it's a international, it's a global organization, so you can learn about all 5 species around the world and where people are seeing and catching sawfish really around the world. And one of the key projects is the See a Saw project. And so big shout out here to Nicole Phillips, Kelsey Smith, and Anne-Marie Fearing. So they are going around and getting genetic samples from these isolated rostra. I mentioned that people would keep sawfish rostra as trophies or buy them as souvenirs. And so, we're finding hundreds of these sawfish rostra in museums, in people's homes, in libraries, big shops, stores, schools, restaurants even. And so I mentioned, they're able to get DNA from where the rostrum was removed from the head. And so if you ever see a sawfish rostrum, or if you own one, or a friend has one, or your marine lab has one, we would love to get a sample from here, take some measurements from it, photograph it, get some DNA from this. We will come to you to do it, or we have a kit that we can actually send you that has step-by-step instructions of how you can collect this sample for us and send it in. So keep an eye out for sawfish rostra and let us know if you ever see one. So what we've learned about sawfish in now 21 years since we've been doing the research on them in Florida, they're born about 2 feet long. And here's a picture of a saw covered in what we call a sheath. So nature has found a way that the mother sawfish can hold 7 to 14 young sawfish while they're developing and give birth to them and survive that process with all of those having this tooth-lined rostra, and that is with this sheath. So the teeth are encapsulated in this thick gelatinous goo, and then that will dissolve off in a couple days after the sawfish is born, and they can go about using their saw. It takes a long time for sawfish to reach sexual maturity. So I mentioned that low reproductive potential as being one of the reasons why the population declined. And they have to be about 7 years old and 11 or 12 feet long before they even start reproducing. So some people ask if we're going to have a stock enhancement program, brood sawfish in captivity to repopulate. And it'd be kind of hard at this point because they have to be so big, it takes them so long, and because they have so few young, only about a dozen young when they do give birth, which might be annually, might be every other year. So it's not really cost effective at this point for us to look at that. Atlantis in the Bahamas is the only facility that has had sawfish give birth. And their facility is an open environment. It's a lagoon open to the air. And so they have been successful at as a sawfish giving birth there in that facility. We still don't know how long sawfish live in the wild. We know the ones in SeaWorld in Orlando have been there since the 80s. But since our research is only 20 years old, we've had some that have had some long-term recaptures, but we really at this point don't know how long they live in the wild. And we don't know how many are still out there. So that's one of the questions that we're getting at with the DNA that we're sending off and building that family tree, trying to get at how many sawfish are left out there in the wild. So they feed predominantly on fish, and they use this rostra to find and catch their prey fish. So if you're familiar with the snout of a shark, it has ampullae of Lorenzini, these sensory pores all along the snout of a shark. And those pores are also on the underside of the sawfish rostrum. So you can think about, they kind of use the sawfish rostrum like a metal detector. They'll swim over the sand and they can detect small fish, crabs, or shrimp in the sand. And then large sawfish will actually swipe that saw like a baseball bat and stun or impale fish, and then go back and get it with their mouth, which is here on the underside. The teeth in their mouth aren't sharp, They're just a plate of teeth, kind of like our back teeth, just flat, broad teeth. And they actually suck in their fish whole when they're eating them. And here is a great video taken by Barbara Warringer that's gonna show this. So here's a sawfish swiping super fast at a prey fish. And here's another one, gonna pin down this fish here and then go just suck it in whole. Slurp it right up there. That was quick, so I'm gonna play that again. Oh, so cool to watch. So our priorities now in the US are law enforcement. We need to beef up law enforcement. And we still have a lot of research to do. I mentioned we don't know how old they get. We still need to designate critical habitat for adults if it's necessary. But here's some examples of why law enforcement is such a big priority for us, why we need to do more outreach and education. So here's a sawfish in Fort Lauderdale. It was found at a boat ramp at a cleaning station. Someone had left the saw in the head, had cleaned it, presumably to eat it, but it's an endangered species, so catch and release only, you can't do that. Here's an example from Jacksonville. A commercial fisherman, a shrimper, was actually filmed by a recreational fisherman using a sawzall to cut the saw off of a live sawfish. That went to trial, and he received 2 years probation, 80 hours of community service, and a fine of $2,000. So we have a long way to go for that to make the penalties hit the crime for killing endangered species there. And here's an example by me. This is the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office. They were doing a safety check on a shrimp trawl boat and found this sawfish rostrum. And the captain of the shrimp boat admitted to being down in the Florida Keys, catching the sawfish, killing it, and keeping the sawfish rostrum as a trophy. That case is still pending. So adult critical habitat, I mentioned that we designated critical habitat for juveniles for the nursery function that it provides, but we don't know for adults yet if there is any habitat that we should protect, what the features of that would be. There's a new paper that just came out that's going to help us answer some of this, led by Jasmine Graham, Florida State University. But we don't know if there are mating areas for sawfish. So do these big sawfish congregate to mate at a certain area at a certain time, or do they just mate when they happen to pass each other? We don't know. Do they have feeding areas? Are there foraging grounds where sawfish go, to feed at a certain time of year? Do they have specific migratory corridors that we should protect? Some of the features of those habitats, we still don't know. Still some of our ongoing questions there. So outreach and education, I mentioned a big thing for us. Here's an example from lockdown last year of several sawfish that were purposefully killed. Some had their rostrum removed. This was at the north end of Everglades National Park on the Choctawhy Causeway. Big reward was issued for information in that case, $25,000. But unfortunately, we have not received any information about that case. Here is a sawfish that a picture a diver took off Fort Lauderdale of a sawfish that was wrapped up in a ghost gill net. Was on the bottom, it was dead, it was decaying, had suffocated in this gill net. Another example of a sawfish that was caught in a shrimp trawl and was hung up to die. Here's an example from Everglades National Park in their creel survey. One of our team members, Jason Seitz, runs the creel survey program in Everglades National Park. And they actually found someone had caught 2 baby sawfish. We're going to eat them clearly because they were cleaned and dressed here. So education to let people know they're endangered, can't keep them. And we're really focusing on mishandling by anglers and disturbance of sawfish by divers. So here's a lot of examples of mishandling by anglers. You need to leave the sawfish in the water. Don't sit on it. Don't pull it up on the shore, pull it up on the beach. If you grab a sawfish by the tail and you're pulling it up on the sand, because it's the ray, it's got the gill slits on the underside, you're just filling that with sand and rocks and debris. So not good. So we create a lot of these materials that normally, if we were meeting in person, I'd be giving you guys all kinds of swag, but we have stickers and keychains and wallet cards and tackle box cards with the information of what to do if you do, if you're lucky enough to catch a sawfish. Leave it in the water, especially the gills, leave that in the water. Don't use gaffs or ropes to secure the sawfish. Just cut the line as close to the hook as possible. That saw is going to be thrashing around. You don't want to be on the receiving end and get hit by that saw. So just cut the line as close to the hook as possible. That hook is going to rust out and that sawfish can be on its way. They're pretty hardy. We know from some research that from blood work that they're not very stressed when they're caught. So if they're handled properly, we know that they can survive in interaction with humans if the steps are followed properly. It's left in the water. So divers, we're also creating some materials for divers. I'm so jealous of y'all on the other coast getting to have this beautiful clear water and see these sawfish when you're diving. But if a sawfish swims away because of your presence, then you've gotten too close to it. And because we don't know if there are mating areas for sawfish or feeding grounds for sawfish, if these guys are congregating to rest after giving birth, they're there for a reason, and we need to be safe when we're around them. Make sure we don't disturb them. Don't try to sit on them. Don't try to lay on them. Don't try to feed them. Just bask in the glory of seeing a sawfish when you're diving. So jealous, but just try to keep your distance so you don't disturb them, because they're there for a reason, and we need to make sure that we don't disturb whatever that aggregation is there for. So we're hanging up these signs. We have metal signs that we hang at boat ramps and fishing piers, marinas, laminated signs we put in tackle shops, bait shops, dive centers, with the guidance for anglers and divers on how to safely and legally interact with any sawfish you're lucky enough to see. We have rack cards that we're distributing in brochure stands here. So if you know anywhere that Mike could use some of these, I would be more than happy and thrilled to send them your way if you know a facility that has a display that we could put these in. So we ask everybody to let us know if they catch or see a sawfish. It helps us target our field surveys, just like the guys with Harbor Branch being able to respond and get out there and put a transmitter in a sawfish. But it also helps us monitor our management efforts to see if what we're doing is successful. It helps us see the population expanding, getting into some of these areas where they used to be found, but we haven't had reports in a while, like Tampa Bay and the Indian River Lagoon. And we're starting to get more and more reports from these areas, which is wonderful that we're seeing this population start to expand into some of its historic range again. So the information that we get from the public is huge and is so key to the research that we do. I have a monthly sawfish news article that I write and publish in a lot of fishing magazines and newspapers and online blogs. In y'all's area, Coastal Angler Magazine on the Treasure Coast publishes them. Fishing Wire, which is an email newsletter, Mullet Wrapper is a newspaper in Everglades. But if you know of a magazine or newspaper or email newsletter that might enjoy sharing the monthly sawfish news, just let me know. So October 17th every year is International Sawfish Day. We're cautiously optimistic that this year we'll get to do in-person events again. But if not, we'll have this online extravaganza of celebrating sawfish around the world. Researchers and facilities around the world will do different events and give presentations online, pass out swag to people. So mark that for October 17th and follow International Sawfish Day hashtag on social medias for all kinds of information. So the future outlook here in the United States, that large tooth sawfish, unfortunately, we consider that one locally extinct. That's the one that's been 60 years since we've had that one in our waters. But the small tooth sawfish, we actually do expect that one to recover. We are cautiously optimistic that we can save the ones we have left, that we can get the population to expand back out into some of its former range. I mean, we don't expect it to be from Texas to North Carolina again, but We would love to see it at least move up out of just South Florida again. And we are starting to see some encouraging signs of that already. But we've got to keep that gillnet ban that was instituted in the early 1990s. Again, that wasn't done for sawfish, but I think a lot of the positive signs we're seeing in the population today was because of that net ban in the 90s. We also have to keep Everglades National Park and the restoration efforts that are going on. And so Zach mentioned the presentation, I think it was next week, he said, on the Everglades National Park Restoration Project. That's important for sawfish because one of the factors for the nursery habitat is that euryhaline environment. So we need that freshwater sheet flow flowing into Everglades National Park so that Florida Bay doesn't get so hypersaline, so salty because there's not the freshwater flowing into it. So Everglades Restoration Project is very important for sawfish, as well as keeping our national park down there in South Florida. We've done a lot of research. We've had a lot of management progress in the last 20 years. And we're starting to see an increase in public awareness of sawfish and people happily following the handling and release and the diver guidelines and helping us with our research efforts and sharing information with other people. And here's some great example of that from over there on y'all's coast. If you go to Space Coast Daily, they ran an article during lockdown last year of several big sawfish that were videoed in the Indian River Lagoon in Melbourne Beach. And thanks to Night Heron Light Tackle, here is a beautiful picture of a sawfish that they got in their Humminbird fish finder. So we are thankfully starting to see more and more reports of sawfish up in that way. We're doing a lot of outreach, we're hanging up a lot of signs, printing a lot in media, asking people to report them to us, but we are also seeing a lot of reports from that area now, which is great news. So I mentioned that if you ever see a sawfish rostrum, to let me know so we can get some DNA from it. And here's some fun examples of how common sawfish are in TVs and movies and popular culture. Here's a video game where a sawfish uses a sawfish to saw things down while he's trying to destroy the world. In decoration in old TV shows, Magnum PI, Batman had a sawfish rostrum in his apartment. The Pirates of the Caribbean, the ghost pirates use sawfish rostra as weapons in the movie. A couple other from Law and Order episodes, TV show. Blade Runner, Point Break, in the party house, they had a sawfish rostra. A recent show, Silicon Valley, an old movie that I haven't seen, but an old Tom Hanks, Halle Berry movie, Cloud Atlas, had several sawfish on display in that movie. And what I think is the best movie ever made, what inspired me to become a marine biologist and want to work with sharks and be Matt Hooper when I grew up, Jaws. Even Quint had two sawfish rostra in his cottage, one of each species actually. So here's a large tooth rostra hanging here, and here's a small tooth rostrum hanging here. So of course I have to thank all the organizations that fund my research. Everything I do is on grants and contracts and donations from the public and people like you. So I have to thank everybody who normally would pay for me to travel around the state and give this presentation in person, and all the swag that I would distribute out. And if you feel so inclined that you want to donate and help our research or our outreach, help me make more signs and distribute them places, you can go to havenworth.wedid.it to make a tax deductible donation. And I'm going to leave you here with my contact information. I do have a monthly email newsletter. You can sign up for that on my website if you want. I'm on all the socials, of course, Facebook at Havenworth Coastal Conservation, Twitter and Instagram at Coastal Elasmos. Elasmos is short for elasmobranch, which are the sharks, skates, and rays. The second one's listed here, the Sawfish Recovery. That's our U.S. Sawfish Recovery Team. That's a lot of policy, management, legal information about sawfish in the United States. And then the third ones listed here are the Sawfish Conservation Society, that open public Facebook group, which is very fun. And then they're also on Twitter and Instagram. And here is my phone number and my email if you have any other burning sawfish questions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Zach to facilitate our Q&A.
Wow, Tonya, thank you so much. That was incredible. I mean, I came into this with a pretty blank slate of expectations, and I am just so excited to hear the Sawfish story tonight. Really, really cool story that you told. Amazing old antique photos, and tying that into today's science. I think our audience absolutely loved it, and I could tell they loved it because this is probably more questions than we've ever gotten from any of. That's okay. The good news is, most of the questions that came in early, you've already addressed. So as you went through your presentation, we got questions about, are they edible? Can you breed them in captivity? Are there efforts to restore populations? And you've already addressed a lot of those, but what I'm going to do is start working through the questions that you haven't had a chance to address yet. If any of you have questions, go ahead and add them in. I know I learned so much tonight, and I'm hoping that you guys did as well as our audience. I know some of you won't stay for the entire question and answer session. For those of you that are getting ready to say goodnight, please remember we have one more lecture next week, a week from tonight, and then we have that special Everglades restoration lecture on March 30th. I'll tell you more about that next week. So our first audience question has to do with sawfish size. Looking at those historical black and white photos, there were enormous sawfish in the past. Yes. Do you see sawfish today that are of a similar size?
The largest one that we've seen in the last several decades during our research is just over 16 feet. And so we've seen some videos of other ones from the Keys that are about that, but that's the largest that we have found in recent day. Unfortunately, it's about 16 feet. Now, I will say that they look a lot bigger when you catch one than they are. So even us, when we catch them and we're bringing them up, like this one here, this was in 9 Mile Bank in Florida Bay. The longer a sawfish gets, the wider it gets. Its pectoral fins get very wide, so they're a little misleading on how big they are. So they look a lot bigger than they are. So we'll bring them up and we're like, oh my God, that thing's got to be 16 feet, and then we measure it and it's 14 feet. So it's a little deceptive, but yeah, nowadays 16 feet is the maximum that we get here in the U.S.
So we have a great question about the Everglades and Lake Okeechobee discharges. Obviously, water flow through the Everglades affects salinity in Florida Bay. Sometimes there's too much, sometimes there's not enough. Yeah. Do you think that the Everglades water issues that we're going to talk about on the 30th, do you think those could potentially have an impact on sawfish populations?
Yes, most definitely. The northern shoreline of Florida Bay, so snake bite, basically from Key Largo over to East Cape Canal, that whole entire mangrove shoreline, we get reports of juvenile sawfish in there. So we know that that's a nursery area. And because they need that euryhaline environment where freshwater and saltwater are mixing, that sheet flow from Everglades Restoration Project is very important, because there are times that normal seawater is about 32 parts per thousand salt, just to give you some reference. But there have been times that we've been down in Florida Bay that the salinity is over 50, sometimes approaching 60. I mean, it gets super salty in there when that freshwater sheet flow is not flowing down into Florida Bay. And that's not good for anything. I mean, that kills off seagrass, takes all the oxygen out of the water where, really nothing can live in there. So yeah, Everglades restoration is very important for that. And to jump on that, a little bit about red tide, because that's another question we get with sawfish and red tide, because we've had a bad bloom on the southwest coast over here several years ago, and we're already getting one now. Luckily for us, the juvenile sawfish are in lower salinity water than the red tide can handle. So when we had the really bad red tide event a few years ago, we didn't have mortality of sawfish from that, because red tide can't tolerate really low salinities, which is where the sawfish are. So thankfully, at least in that regard, red tide wasn't a problem for the juvenile sawfish. And we just kind of assumed that the adult sawfish would swim off to somewhere else that actually had oxygen in the water and food to eat and things like that. However, saying that, when a sawfish dies, it'll sink to the bottom. It doesn't float. They usually don't wash up like a whale or a dolphin or something like that. So we don't get the mass casualties that we would expect with some of the other animals, or a bony fish like snook. When we have a bad freeze and we see a bunch of snook die from the freeze and they wash up, we wouldn't see that with sawfish. But yes, the Everglades Restoration Project is very important for sawfish to maintain that nursery habitat in that area, which is a very key nursery area for sawfish.
Great. How far from the coastline can you encounter adult sawfish and juvenile sawfish? And then what are the preferred depth ranges for both of those life stages?
Excellent question. So the most that we've recorded them is at about 200 feet deep. And an interesting thing is that none of our sawfish that we have tagged in Florida have been detected in the Bahamas. And none of them, when we've tagged in the Bahamas, have been detected in the United States. So they don't cross between, is it depth? Is it the Gulf Stream? We're not sure. Are they two separate populations? We're also not sure. So we're collecting DNA from the sawfish in the Bahamas. Also figure out, part of our family tree of sawfish is, are they separate populations? Because at this point, it doesn't seem like they're interacting with each other between the US and the Bahamas. We were supposed to go to Cuba and start a field project on Cuba in 2020, but we all know how 2020 went, so we weren't able to go there. But we have colleagues in country who are starting to collect DNA from sawfish rostrum for us to start building the tree in Cuba as well. But the juveniles, they tend to stay very shallow. So they're born about 3 feet. They'll double in size to 6 feet in their first year of life, but they'll stay, 10 feet of water or less. I mean, usually 3 feet of water or less. They're usually, seen a lot by fishermen who are cruising the shoreline looking for snook and redfish, because they're a lot of times under the mangrove overhang, the fringing overhang of the mangroves. So the juveniles are going to stay super shallow. The adult sawfish, once they get to be about 8-10 feet, and they'll venture out of the estuary, out of the bays, into the Gulf of Mexico or into the Atlantic. They tend to stay on the shelf. Like I said, we had a satellite tag that recorded one up to 200 feet. We don't get a lot of that in the Gulf coastally, but they tend to stay, in the coastal waters and don't go very deep.
All right, so somebody has a question about your applied research. How do you capture sawfish for tagging purposes?
Yes, that's a slide I should add. Thank you for that. So we have several methods. So for the small sawfish, like this one here, we use short gill nets. So we have gill nets that are 100 feet long. We'll deploy them in shallow water. I'm actually sitting in this picture, so it's a little deceptive. I'm in about 2 feet of water here, sitting on the bottom holding this sawfish in super muddy water. But so for the small ones, we use a gill net with 4-inch mesh. We'll set that in shallow water. We actually sit there and monitor it, remove animals as they're being caught. For large sawfish, we use a bottom long line, which is in this photograph over here on the left. So a bottom long line it's like a hefty trot line, but it's a long rope that's about a mile long, and we hang about 100 hooks, 50 hooks off of it. And those hooks will sit on the bottom. They're spaced apart, so if we catch things on consecutive hooks, they can't get tangled in each other. But so this will sit on the bottom, and that's how we catch the big ones. We also sometimes will catch them on rod and reel. So there's places where we go where we can't set a gill net because of boat traffic or because there's manatees there or dolphins are present. So we actually sometimes will use rod and reel as well. But gill net and long line are our predominant gears that we use. And in the Florida Keys, where the water's deeper, Florida State University has a long line. It's like a commercial style long line that's actually on a winch. I'm fortunate here in Tampa Bay. My water never gets deeper than like 20 feet, except in the ship channel. So I do all my long lining by hand. But down in the deeper water off the Keys, like especially off some of the reefs and the wrecks that are like 120 feet deep down there in the Keys, he uses a winch to pull in his long line there.
when you are processing a sawfish during one of your field studies, is there a way to utilize stable isotope analysis, either of blood, muscle tissue, or feces, to try to identify the overall diet composition that the animal's been eating?
Great question. Yes, we did that with feces. So usually, for sharks and rays, if you want to know what they're eating, we do what's called gastric lavage, where we'll put a hose in their throat, we'll push some water in there, and it'll flush out everything that they've eaten in their stomach. Or for some sharks, you can actually reach in and pull their stomach out. They do that naturally. They'll invert their stomach to get rid of all the bony parts and scales and bones from the things that they can't digest. So we can take advantage of that. Well, we can't do that with sawfish because it's an endangered species. We are actually limited on what we are allowed to do to them as well. So to find out what they were feeding, which we wanted to know so we would know what to use for bait, we actually used feces. And so when we were working up the sawfish, sometimes they were nice enough, kind enough to leave us a sample on the measuring board. And we actually sent that off to Florida Gulf Coast University, and they did the stable isotope analysis for us. And were able to tell us that they're feeding on mostly schooling fish, like ladyfish, jack, mullet, things like that. And so that's what we use for our bait. Yeah, good question.
You mentioned some of the issues with the GPS-based tracking tags because they don't break the surface often enough. So somebody was wondering whether you've ever used the pop-up archival tags, the tags that stay attached to the animal for a period of time and then float to the surface to transmit. Have you been able to use those with any success to look at long distance movements?
Yes. So we have had limited success with those as well. When we started using those, if you're familiar with the PAT tags, back in the day when we started using those, they kept popping off prematurely and we couldn't figure out why. And the manufacturer had coated them with, they called it a death switch, so that if your animal didn't move, the tag would assume it was dead and pop off so that you would be able to get your information from it. And so our tags kept popping off and we're like, what's happening? This was 20 years ago. And we realized that because when we would release a sawfish, it would go back to its life as a sawfish and sit on the bottom, and the tags would assume it was dead. So the tag would pop off, float to the surface, and transmit like 5 minutes worth of data. So we finally were able to work with the manufacturer to get that death switch turned off for us so that we could use it on an animal that would spend most of its time sitting on the bottom. So we have had some success with those tags. But unfortunately, a lot of them have popped off in areas around mangroves, and they weren't able to transmit to the satellite, or they kind of patchy transmitted to the satellite. So we had a lot better success with the PATs than we did with the spots. Here's actually a picture of a sawfish. This was, 20 years ago. I'm so young in that picture. But we put a spot on this sawfish, and yeah, just didn't work. Never heard from it. It never broke the surface, or if it did, it was under the mangrove overhang and we didn't hear from it. So we stopped using spots, went to the PATs, have had some success with that, do have a couple papers published on movements with the PATs, but we're having so much more success with the transmitters and the receivers now. The only bad thing about those is you have to go get the data from the receivers. So often that requires divers going in and getting the receiver, bringing the receiver back to the boat, downloading it to a computer. Then you put the receiver back in, then you go back to the lab, upload those data to iTag or FACT to share with everybody. So you don't get the instant gratification that you can from the spot tags, but we're getting really good long-term data from those tags now, finally.
Great. And we have time for a couple more questions. I apologize if I don't get to every question tonight. We've had, tremendous outpouring of questions. It's such a cool topic, and people are obviously excited to learn more. What is the longest migration that you guys have documented so far from your tagging data?
So historically, we thought that they would go as far as like New York. But now with the tags that we've used so far, we've had animals go from the Keys to just inside of Georgia. So that's the furthest that we've had them. Most of them will go from the Keys to Cape Canaveral and back, or from the Keys to Tampa Bay and back. or just to Charlotte Harbor and back. But the longest that we've had, we actually had an animal recaptured in a shrimp trawl that had an observer on board, thankfully. But one of the animals tagged in the Keys was detected and recaptured just into Georgia, so just north of Jacksonville in Georgia. But that's the furthest we had so far. And again, none have gone over to Mexico or Texas. They've all stayed along the shore of Florida, whether they go up in the Gulf to Tampa Bay, they stay along the coast because they're getting detected on the receivers along the coast, or if they go up to Cape Canaveral, they're being detected along the coast there. So they're not really going offshore, not going to the Bahamas. Yeah, so from the Keys to Georgia,
Great.
furthest we know of so far.
You talked a little bit about the predation of juvenile sawfish by sharks. Are there any natural predators of adult sawfish?
Not that we're aware of, no. There's a photograph of a tiger shark, an old black and white photograph of a tiger shark that had about a 3-foot rostrum in it. So that would have been about a 9-10 foot animal. And in Australia, we know that the crocodiles and the alligators will eat, and from the Everglades, we know that those also eat sawfish, but mostly juvenile sawfish. So mostly once a sawfish gets over about 8 feet long, there's not much that's going to mess with it, except us, unfortunately. But yeah.
Do you think that the large tooth sawfish rostra that you see on display in the east coast of the U.S. at museums and bait shops and in people's homes, do you think they originally came from a population that inhabited our area, or are they from somewhere else and they've been brought over for curio display purposes?
Yep, I think some of both. I've collected about 100 in Texas, and so some of those were caught in Texas. Some of those were bought. You can go. Unfortunately, people still sell them on eBay, which is illegal, so don't do that. But a lot of them people acquired when they were on vacation, in Central or South America as well. And because there was such a trade in sawfish rostra, they really come from everywhere. So some of the museums, they've come from Australia, some other places. So it's kind of a mix of both, where they're from here, but also from other places. And our amazing DNA lab people are actually trying to develop where they can identify where a sawfish rostra came from the DNA. So collecting DNA from rostras of known origin, they're creating the database, and then we hope to eventually, like if a sawfish rostra gets confiscated in trade at the airport by customs, be able to identify where that sawfish rostra came from, or the fins, for example, get confiscated in trade in Asia, going to shark fin soup trade. Hopefully, eventually we'll be able to identify where that originated from the DNA the library of DNA that we're developing. So any and all sawfish rostra are incredibly valuable, whether they're of known origin or not, to add to our library of DNA.
Great. I hate to pull the plug. I have so many great questions. I think I'm going to stay on for another minute or two. We'll try to squeeze one or two more quick questions in. Globally speaking, where are the largest populations of large tooth sawfish today? And in those areas, are there conservation efforts similar to what you're seeing here in Florida?
Yep. So we get them still in Central and South America. Not very many of them. So there used to be a very large population of large tooth sawfish in Lake Nicaragua, but in the 70s, they opened a fishery for large tooth sawfish and the bull sharks in Lake Nicaragua, and they completely fished them out. There are efforts underway in Brazil to conserve sawfish. There are research projects underway currently in Mexico, Costa Rica, Belize. Some of these places, they've been doing field research for a number of years and have yet to catch a sawfish. That's how rare they are. And unfortunately, most of the time when a sawfish is caught, we find out about it because it winds up in a market. Either the saw shows up in a market or the fins show up in a market, and that's how we have become aware of it. But yes, we are pushing for for more protections for species around the world in some of these other countries. But the United States, our population is actually doing the best. Us in Australia, as sad as it to say, as sad as shape as our population is doing in, we're actually one of the best populations of it. So trying to export some of the successes that we've had for conservation to other places around the world.
And our last question tonight's an important one. Have anglers and divers been receptive to your outreach efforts? Do those user groups seem to support your conservation efforts?
Mostly, yes. For the most part, yes. People are so awed about sawfish and also want to protect them. The biggest concern we get from people is that they're fearful of sharing information with us because they're afraid we're going to close down their fishing area, or shut an area off to diving, or close an area off to shrimping. And we don't have to do that as long as the handling and release guidelines and the viewing guidelines are followed, because we know sawfish can survive in interaction with humans if they're handled properly and released properly. So I think the more outreach we do, the more we're able to share why we're collecting the information and how it's used and how it's not used. We're not creating closed zones, we're not creating no access zones, we're not stopping construction from happening. So, so for the most part, yes, the public has been amazing at helping us with our research, and that citizen science aspect of the research has really been key to all that we've been doing the last 20 years.
All right, Tonya, I think we have to wrap it up there. Thank you so much. Such a cool presentation. I mean, this is a really important story for us here in Florida. And, I know it's just the tip of the iceberg, but you did an awesome job of giving everybody a great crash course on sawfish conservation. To all of my audience members who are still hanging in there, believe it or not, there's well over 100 people still hanging out for the Q&A session, which is awesome. I hope to see you guys 1 week from tonight for Dr. Annie Page Cargin's presentation about health issues affecting our charismatic marine creatures, our dolphins, whales, and sea turtles. And then we'll see you again, hopefully on March 30th for that special encore presentation looking at Everglades restoration efforts. And then one last reminder to all of our new attendees tonight, be sure to check out our website. We've got a bunch of great recordings of this year's lectures online. You can watch them at your leisure, pretend that they're live. It feels better when it's live, but recordings are the next best thing, I guess, in today's digital world. Thank you again, everybody. Thank you again, Tonya, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.